Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Jennifer Wistrand. Jennifer is Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. She joins us to talk about the latest from Ukraine. Jennifer, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, when I anticipated speaking with you a couple of weeks ago when we booked this interview, Ukraine had not launched its sneak attack into the Kursk region, and that certainly provides the focus for where we should begin. Did anyone see this coming, and what are the implications of this move?
It's an excellent question, and I would just echo what you said when you asked me to speak with you a couple of weeks ago. I thought, well, we're going to be in a quiet period in August, and here we are 1 week into what I think many think is an unanticipated offensive. Whether or not we should find it unanticipated is a big question. As to whether we saw it coming, I guess that would depend upon who you ask. I think a lot of people did not foresee it coming. There had been a great deal of talk that morale was low in Ukraine because of the fact that the war was not trending in its favor. You have another school year coming up, so it'll be the third school year. The kids who left with their families are not going to be in, so morale is low. And then this happens, and implications are yet to be determined. On the one hand, it's the first time that the Ukrainian military, so let's go back to morale. I think it has boosted morale internally in the country. Whereas you had, for the first time in the last couple of weeks, you had some of the Ukrainian population talking about, do we need to think about going to the negotiating table? And that certainly had not been on the table for the past 2.5 years. And people had finally started thinking, do we have to do that? Now I think you have potentially a chance to see that flip and say, actually, this demonstrates we don't have to go there. Or other people are saying maybe Ukraine still has to go to the negotiating table, but maybe the impetus for this surprise attack or sneak attack is that it gives them a bargaining chip, right? They've got some territory now in Russia. So I think it still remains to be seen what the outcome is.
When you said the third school year since the invasion began, it really struck home. I remember when this all began, well, certainly Russia thought it would be quick and over. Here we are 2.5 years later, and there's no end in sight. On this incursion, the Ukraine Foreign Ministry says not interested in holding territory. But it also says it'll continue its offensive in Russia until Moscow agrees to peace. There seems to be a notion from comments from the ministry, comments from President Zelensky, that this will somehow force Putin to the negotiating table. Do you see any indication that that's a realistic expectation?
That's a difficult question. I mean, I myself, as you probably were doing the same, listening to the news or the actual live reporting coming out. And if you listen to the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, it's par for what it's been for the past 2.5 years, right? Russia is saying that this is an offensive by, the aggressors to start with, and they're defending themselves. And so were it to motivate Putin to come to the negotiating table, under what premise would he be coming there? I think that's unclear. I think what will be interesting, I could only see him being motivated in some respect if he starts to see his own population on that flank that's being attacked right now, disseminating information further into the country, right? Thus far, there's been kind of an endemic support for him and his positions, but it's the first time you see, internally displaced people spreading throughout Russia, where that's been the norm throughout Ukraine, right? And is that going to happen? People, literally the mayors in towns out there requesting of Putin to send help and saying, you're not supporting us, bolstering us the way you said you would. So if he were to feel threatened in some respect, could that cause him to want to negotiate? I suppose, but again, it's been two sides with two very different dialogues the entire time. It's difficult to see how that would result in any meaningful endgame.
So you mentioned earlier that this may have been a response to the need for a morale boost. Is that ultimately what this is about? I've looked at the analysis from the military experts to see if anyone views this as a game changer on the battlefield. And I haven't found anyone, maybe you have, who has thought that's the case. But morale keeps coming up as something that could be, within Ukraine could be one of the benefits of this incursion. Where was morale before this? As you mentioned, there was a bit of a malaise underway. Other things like Gaza, the NATO summit, the U.S. Election were stealing headlines away, and the war had sort of drifted into this almost chronic condition. Is this a jolt to the system? Is this something that was needed to break it out of this chronic stage?
Yeah, excellent question. So, kind of breaking it into several parts. First you mentioned, is this any type of, significant military incursion? Again, I think we have to wait to see, but we still have to step back and look at, present time. Russia occupies what, somewhere between 15 and 20% of Ukraine. So they still obviously have a significant foothold in Ukraine. There's nowhere that this kind of small part of the Kursk region is nowhere comparable to that yet from a morale perspective. Absolutely has boosted. It's the first time that Ukraine has been able to cross into Russia. Obviously, it's not coincidental. This is coming after it's been able to kind of receive a significant influx of military equipment from the West. That also was a morale boost, I think, for Ukraine, which had been waiting for quite a long period of time and then did receive that and now has the capability to actually move more assertively as opposed to, defensively. You pointed out too, kind of media fatigue develops with any number of crises, right? It's a recurrent problem around the world, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Sudan, whether it's Haiti. These conflicts end up in the news and then they tend to fade. And I think Ukrainians have long feared that that's going to be their case too, and that would be to Russia's advantage, right? If this kind of drifts into the, as opposed to NATO kind of perennially bringing this up, if this kind of slips away. So I actually do think, at least right now, the morale seems to be kind of I certainly can't speak for President Zelensky or any others what motivated it, but it does seem that maybe that's the byproduct of it. That's the greatest kind of result from this, is the morale boost.
So, what can you tell us about the mood in Ukraine? Beyond the morale question, just about daily life. What do we know about, when we view it geopolitically or we view it from a distance, we don't really get the visceral sense of what it's like to live with the constant threat of a potential drone attack or bomb attack or whatever it might be. How stable or unstable is daily life in Ukraine? And how does that look when you go from region to region or city to city?
An excellent question. I would say we, the Kennan Institute, are very fortunate that we have a number of colleagues that are either based inside Ukraine or they're Ukrainians who are now based elsewhere in Europe, for example, in Italy. And then we also have Russian colleagues who had fled with the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, and also based in parts of Europe and corresponding with their Ukrainian colleagues. So we're very fortunate to be able to get actual information coming out of what's going on in the country. And I think, again, there too, it depends on what aspect of someone's mood, what might you ask them about, right? I circle back to family separation is a huge issue, right? In terms of displacement takes many forms, and the way this conflict came about, most of the men were staying in, not all, not exclusively, right? A lot of the men, though, there's a mandate for certain age groups to stay in the country, right? The initial and even second and tertiary fluxes of people who left the country were women and children. We're heading into a third school year, so you have a lot of family separation that is now becoming long-term, and in some cases is leading to some kind of family separating what could be longer term. And so that's obviously not a positive for people. You have, for a while, there were economic concerns domestically, right? The fear is like going to default. Is the country going to default on some debt? So now there's been help that they're going to be able to restructure their debt. So obviously, the day-to-day economic concerns, but then it's incredible. And again, in Kennan Institute, we have people writing on the arts, writing on the culture, all these other areas that have been able to maintain a presence throughout the conflict. You just had the Ukrainians that competed in the Olympics, right? Brought a lot of pride for their country. So there are things that are, again, keeping people's spirits up, but on a day-to-day. And you asked the question on regionally. Obviously, certainly if you're in the eastern part of the country, you're much either in an occupied area or much closer to the front lines than if you are in the west. So that's going to be a big difference as well. If you're in Kyiv, you're the site of the capital, which is obviously a target for the Russians, some of the other big cities as well, Kharkiv. So I think it's difficult to say on day to day, be kind of what aspect of someone's day to day, do they feel?
So, with the NATO summit, we've talked about media fatigue. Is there any concern about ally fatigue or support for Ukraine? Where does that stand now? Certainly, it got a huge boost from the NATO summit, which made strong statements in support. And beyond talk, there were actual changes in what kind of munitions and other weaponry that was provided to Ukraine. Is there any concern within Ukraine about support for Ukraine encountering the kind of fatigue we've been talking about in these other areas?
Yeah, I think that also is always a perennial concern, right? Again, you circle back to like in Afghanistan or other situations that it ends up in the news and then it dissipates from the news, or two, there's initial support and then that support dissipates because we need to spread our humanitarian aid elsewhere. So I think certainly you look at a number of countries, again, let's take, human mobility, people who fled, refugees, very well welcomed. In many cases, other countries claim, why weren't our refugees welcomed in the way that Ukrainian refugees were? But now, a couple of years later, certain countries are starting to say, well, what should there be programs for the Ukrainians to go back? Or is this somehow, kind of a difficulty on our country's soil? You've had certain countries that have pushed back against, policies with respect to, Ukraine being able to get its grain out, right? Saying, why are they getting preferential treatment and we're not? So I think there could be ally fatigue at some point. I don't foresee that coming, let's say, on the military equipment side, because obviously it's in Europe's interests, right, for Russia not to advance further into Europe.
Yes.
So they would not want Ukraine to somehow completely fall to Russian control. So I don't see that going down, the NATO stronghold part of it. But again, kind of on that day-to-day aspect of it, if the everyday person in a certain town that's either had an influx of people or they feel that their economic livelihood is impacted, yes, that could have a long-term impact.
Let's shift gears and look at Russia. Most of my questions, all of my questions so far have been about what's happening in Ukraine. Well, what do we know about the Russian population? We know what the propaganda machine says. We know what Vladimir Putin says. We know that there's almost total control of media. But what do we know about what the populace in Russia thinks about this war?
That's a very good question. And again, I think if we were to look at, Kennan Institute, and we're very fortunate to have programs that support Russian media in exile. And one of the big objectives of these Russian journalists who are now based in Europe or elsewhere is to be able to hopefully try to penetrate back into the Russian populace and be able to tell them what is actually happening. Because as you stated, we know that the media is controlled within the country. I think, again, you're going to have different perspectives based on, the socioeconomic strata you're looking at, right? Certain people, the Russian economy has actually been able to withhold against sanctions more than people anticipated, right? It's actually still growing. Yes, it has inflation. Yes, it has high interest rates. But it's actually been able to stay on its feet, one, because it's functioning in a wartime economy, but also it's just it has, countries, China, India, Central Asian states, Turkey's other that are supplying it with goods that it would need. So economically, if let's say you're middle income or higher, you've probably been okay. It's going to be your lower income that's impacted. In terms of conscription, right, that we know that there's a lack of people to go to the front lines. Russia's been going through, kind of a lack of regard for its own human life in terms of the war machine. And so there's been a lot of forced conscription, especially from the republics, kind of on the periphery, right? And so you've seen some uprisings in certain areas in reaction to that. So I think that could increase with time, certainly if Russia feels it has to send more troops now to the area of Kursk or other regions. So you could have, again, kind of more uprisings in those peripheral republics within Russia. So I think it really depends geographically where you're looking, socioeconomically where you're looking.
Final question I have for you is about what will you be looking at as we move forward? I know we'll be soon heading toward the fall and then the winter. And in the past, there were some discussions about the impact of troops and equipment on the ground when ground starts to freeze and all those things happen. What are some of the road marks you'll be looking at ahead that might give us some indication of how things are trending?
Yeah, obviously that's an excellent question. The winter obviously poses difficulties, one for just land fighting, that poses an issue, but also just for day-to-day life. But what's been fascinating, and again, we get this coming out of reporting we get from our colleagues based in Ukraine or elsewhere in Europe, that Ukraine has been so just very creative in the way they've responded to the type of problems they've had, creating small generators that are down in subways so that you can run a school in a subway station, and they've responded to the fact that they anticipate there will be electricity outages or other things. And so they've developed mechanisms, again, whether it's for day-to-day life, whether it's for schooling, whether it's for military. So I think, again, talking about the fact you're going into the third time over, on the one hand, yes, you'll see those same problems, but there's a lot of capabilities that have been built up over the past 2 years. So I think the weather will be one, but I really think we just have to see what plays out from this past week, right? Is Ukraine's objective in launching this people calling it sneak or surprise attack? Is it just that, just to be a sneak or surprise attack? Or is it intended to go further? And if it's going to go further into Russia, what's the long-term goal there? Is it going to be tactical, just going after, power plants or other things, or is it going to be to just as Russia has done in the Donbas area, is it going to be to take over regions and be planting the Ukrainian flag? And I think that's going to tell kind of the story that we're looking into moving into the fall and the winter.
Well, I know that whatever happens, you and your colleagues at the Kennan Institute will be staying on top of it. Thank you for joining us today and providing us with this update.
Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.